Certainly by the late 1970s, arson was taking a serious toll on the city and the fire department, particularly in these devastated communities like the South Bronx and East New York and Bushwick. But arson was never the major cause of fire damage in New York. During the 1950s, city fire marshals attributed less than 1% of fires to arson. And until 1975, that ratio never rose above 1.1%. Now, arson numbers did rise rapidly for a few years in the late 1970s. But even at its peak in the late 70s, arson made up less than 7% of fires, according to city fire marshals. Those numbers might have been a little low, but by this time there actually was a pretty serious program, the Red Cap program, that was taking arson very seriously. And so it was no longer the case where fire marshals didn't bother calling suspicious fires suspicious because they weren't going to have time to investigate them. They actually did have time to investigate a lot of these. So that 7% of fires is more accurate. And now, if you account for, of course, higher arson rates in particular neighborhoods like the South Bronx, that 7% goes up some more. But the vast majority of the fires were still commonplace accidents. Electrical wiring problems, space heaters, candles, cigarettes, untended stoves, the result of poor people crammed into crumbling buildings without heat or decent fire service from the city. And in fact, a lot of what gets called arson by fire investigators is not complicated arson for profit. Anytime there was a fire in an abandoned building, they called it arson. A lot of times, though, we're just talking about homeless people living in an abandoned building and using trash for fires and oil drums. People falling asleep with cigarettes in an abandoned building, things like that. These are not intentional arson. This is mistakes, accidents, things like that happened. Man-made, but not a convoluted conspiracy. That was a very real thing, but the numbers just don't back it up. And what's more, arson is occurring primarily in already burned out and abandoned buildings. Whether it's from shady landlords running insurance schemes, scavengers burning out the walls to get at the electrical pipes and sell it off, kids raised in an era of flame who get in on the action by messing around with matches and lighter fluid. It's those kinds of situations where the arson happens. Because after all, it makes a lot more sense for a landlord to torch a building without rent-paying tenants than one that has at least some revenue coming in and that is filled with witnesses who might talk about how you torched that building. You know, in some ways, the job became easier after 1975 or so. Because even though there were all those fires, they were mostly in abandoned buildings, says retired fire commissioner Thomas Von Essen, who worked out of Ladder Company 42 in the South Bronx during the war years. Before then, you actually had people living in all of them. God, it was awful.